What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Quinn Chess, and today we're solving another puzzle on chess.com rated about 2300. So in this puzzle, it looks like we're chasing his king. He's stuck in the middle of the board right here on e4, and we have a couple of rooks that can come in and deliver checks, and pawns that can potentially be used to coerce the king into a spot that we like, and then finish him off. So obviously his king safety is in jeopardy. We have almost no issues with our king safety. Material-wise, though, we are down a knight. He just captured our knight on e4, which I guess was a sort of a bait to get him to come even closer into the center of the board. And that was the blunder that leads him into the current position that he's in. Piece activity-wise, he is woeful. This bishop on d7 is inactive, so is this rook on a8 and the rook on f8, whereas our rook on g5 is quite active, taking away squares along the fifth rank. And this rook, again, on a1 can be brought into the action very, very quickly on e1 or d1. So looking at his king safety even more granularly, so currently these squares are all cut off by our rook, and this square is available to his king on f4. And also this square on d4 is available. These squares are cut off by our pawns on d3, e3, and f3. So we have to decide how exactly we want to chase his king to minimize the available squares that he has and be as close to delivering a checkmate as possible. I think that there is a 90% chance that this puzzle is a checkmate puzzle because even though his pieces are inactive, they're also not really in line to be attacked by any of our pieces. So winning material doesn't look very likely. With that in mind, let's start looking at candidate moves. So the first move that comes to mind is rook e1 check. It's the most active move that we can make. So it delivers a check along the e file, and his king can go to d4 or f4. If his king goes to f4, he's now attacking our rook on g5. So we have to defend that rook. If he goes to d4, we can give a follow-up check with c3 check, but he can run to d3. And the issue with him going to d3 is it looks like he can get away via this c2 square and then threaten to pick up our pawns on b2. He can also, if we do c3 check, he can also take this pawn on c4. So him running to d4 looks like a problem for us. Another move that we can consider is f3 check. F3 check also allows king d4 or king to f4. If he goes to f4, in that case, we do have rook g4 check, and then he can run to f5 and then get away with king to potentially f6, and he looks a lot safer on that square than he was previously. Our pawn does cut off this e7 escape square, so we can potentially do like a rook lift or something like that and try to deliver a checkmate along the f-file if he were to go in that direction. The other issue with f3 check, king f4, king rook g4 check is he can go to e5, in which case he would be attacking this pawn on d6. And with that square in his control, he can get away on c7 or e7. And that's all looking very good for him. So it looks like in either case of how we decide to check him, he has escaped squares, and it's just a matter of how do we limit that as much as possible so that we can deliver a checkmate. Another option is we can just play c3 to take away the g4 square as a preparatory move. He has rook g8 to challenge our rook down the g file in the event that we don't play a check immediately. And that could be very effective because our rook doesn't really have any good squares to go to along the fifth rank to escape that rook check from his rook. If we go to h5, he can keep chasing our rook around, and then if we come back to g5, he can even bring his other rook, and now his pieces are looking very active. And we would have to run to a square or try to protect our rook with like f4 or something. But that would hang a pawn, and that wouldn't be super good for us. So it looks like playing a quiet move here could be too slow. So we really have to dig in here into this puzzle and do some serious calculation. We could also play rook to d1, to cut off some squares from his king to prepare a move like f3 check. But he also has that f4 escape square to go to. And then if we were to play g3 check, he can take our rook or he can take our pawn on f3. So out of those candidate moves, we have to explore a line more in depth. We have to really dig in here and get into it. And the move that I like the most in the beginning that we should, I think, look at is f3 check. And we should just pick a line here and then calculate it to the finish and then start calculating other lines. This is a puzzle that we just have to really hit with rote calculations because our intuition might fail us and we have to just eliminate these possibilities one by one. So after f3 check, he has multiple options. He can go to e3, he can go to d4, he can go to f4. And in each of these cases, in both cases of the fourth rank, he would be attacking a piece of ours. So let's look for the most challenging continuation, which is, let's say, king to f4. After king to f4, we can put our rook on g4 and give him a check there. And in this case, he can run to e3. He can also go to e5. And he can also go to f5. In the event of e5, let's say, so f3 check, king f4, whoops, f3 check, king f4, rook g4 check, king to e5, he's now threatening this pawn on d6. So we can move our rook in to protect that pawn. But like we said, he has rook g8 to hit our rook. And here we can maybe go rook to e4 check, but then he runs to f6, and now he's threatening to get away with king to g7, after which it looks like his king has completely gotten away from us, and we won't be able to checkmate him anymore. So that line doesn't look very promising, and let's find a point that we can revert to and look for a better move. So after f3 check, king to f4, is there another move that we can make? Our rook is under attack, and we definitely have to move it or lose it here. It looks like, we can't play h4, but that move looks a little bit too slow. So if we play h4, probably rook g8 will be his response. And then we can play g3 check, and then he can take on f3, and then we can bring our rook in here on f1, give a check there, and then he can run back to e4 because he's now taken that pawn. And we don't have rook to e5 check available, and we don't have any checks on the g file because his rook can just take our rook. So it looks like he's getting away in that variation as well, but we can keep that in the back of our minds if something else comes up, if we want to re-explore that later. So f3 check, king to f4, or maybe we should look at a different move. Let's look at rook to g4 check. Rook to g4 check, and he can bring his king to f5, and also there our rook is under attack. And if we play f3, we will have to transpose to another variation that we've already calculated. And here it looks like it's quite difficult to prevent him from jumping to f6 as the next move. And that square looks like a lot safer for him. We have to first protect our rook. Let's say we move our rook to g3, he can go to f6, and then if we give a check on f3, he can run to g7. So let's look at a different move now. How about rook to e1 check? Rook to e1 check, still king to f4 is, I think, the main line that we have to consider. There's also king to d4, but let's look at king to f4 first. King to f4 attacking our rook once again. And here we can move our rook to e5 to connect the two rooks. And then he can go king to g4. And then if he does that, we have rook to e4 check, and I think that's a mate because we have all three of these squares covered by our pawns. And then our two rooks are cutting off squares along the 5th and the 4th rank. So that looks pretty promising with rook e1 check, king to f4. And that looks like it's unstoppable, unless, let's say, he goes f5 in that case. If he goes f5, we can play h4 to cut off the the g5 square, because his pawn is now interposing the contention of our rook on that square. And here, does he have any moves to get out of that threat of rook e4 checkmate? Well, the thing with f5 also is that it now contends the e4 square, so we won't be able to deliver a check directly on that square with the rook anymore. But g3 check is also an option. So first h4, and let's say, just looking for like another defensive resource that he could possibly have at his disposal. Let's just say he plays rook g8. Then we can play g3 check. And here, he can't go to g5, he can't go to f5. He can go to g4, however. And in that case, he is threatening to run away to h5. And I'm not seeing how we can actually stop that. But this variation does look already more promising than the last one. So let's revert back to king f4 and see if there's another move that we can make from this position that would be better. We could try h4 to cover our rook. Let's say we play rook to g8. And now if we try g3 check, he would have to go to f3. And then here it looks like rook e3 check is mate with everything covered. So that looks pretty good for us, obviously, because it's a checkmate. Rook e1 check, king to f4 for that reason doesn't work because of this h4 line, which is very good. Let's say he doesn't go to rook g8. Let's say he plays f5. Then he's still susceptible to being checkmated because the e5 square is cut off by our rook on e1. So if we still play g3 check, king f3 is the only move, and then rook to e3 is still checkmate. So both the move rook e3 works in the f5 line and in the rook g8 line. So that means that after rook e1 check, his only move is to go to d4. And if he goes to d4, we can play rook g4 check, and he can't capture this pawn on c4 anymore because our rook is defending it via x-ray. This square is cut off by our e1 rook, so are these squares. This square is cut off by our pawn. This square is also cut off by our pawn, and then this square is cut off by our other pawn. This square is occupied, so rook g4 would actually be mate. So rook e1 is a very good move, and the d4 and the f4 squares are the only moves that he can make with his king. And in both cases, we have a checkmate ready to go. And it looks like he's going to be going f4 because that prolongs the game just a little bit longer. So let's go ahead and lock in this move, rook e1 check. So he does go to f4. And our plan here was to play h4 to defend our rook. And then with the plan of going g3 check, king f3, rook e3 checkmate. Let's just double check that again and make sure that our calculations are correct. So after h4, his king is completely immobilized here on the f4 squares. There's nowhere that he can go. He's a sitting duck. And we're just waiting to play g3 check because our rook here is covered by our pawn. Bringing the rook to g8 to threaten our rook on g5 doesn't stop the check on g3. And there's no other move that he can make to stop that check from happening because his pieces are so inactive and his light square bishop can't do anything. So h4 looks like a good second move to make. And then he attacks our rook by going to f6, but it doesn't matter. We can just play g3 check here, and all those squares are still cut off, and rook e3 is still the plan. So let's go ahead and do that. And that's the end of that puzzle. So the puzzle, they don't continue it, but king f3 and rook e3 should be the finishing blows to the game. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this puzzle today. And what I want to leave you on is a message about chess puzzles. So every chess puzzle to me begins as a mystery, because there's so many moves and it just kind of looks almost magical that there has to be some sort of a solution. And it's a mystery just like life is a mystery, just like art and beauty and women and why your girl won't text you back, etc. And through your efforts in solving the puzzle, you convert that mystery into something that is concrete, which is a solution. So you demystify things by engineering something that is very logical and even mathematical. And your repeated exposure to that process makes you into someone who is a problem solver, someone who is able to take something that's vague and ambiguous and art-like and convert it into something that's scientific. So in order to get the most out of this activity, in order to get multiple returns on investments, you have to think about the process of problem solving on a meta level and how insights and techniques gained here can be applied to other areas where problem solving has value. In every line of work, you're basically being paid to solve problems. And the people who solve the hardest problems, even harder than engineers, are entrepreneurs, because entrepreneurs are facing problems that no one has ever encountered before. And I believe that you can reach this entrepreneur level problem solving by solving chess puzzles and playing chess. So I encourage you to continue watching this channel and learning from our techniques of taking the mystery of chess and breaking it down and converting it into something that is more like the product of engineering, so that we can reverse that process and create beautiful masterpieces that are very art-like or magical, or seem, in these days, seem like something that was created by AI. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. If you liked it, give a channel a subscription, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.